So, returning to Louvain-Neuve,
Yeah.
we will now hear Felipe Morales Carbonell. How possible explanation for impossibilities? You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be back here. Every time I've been here, it's been really lovely, and and I'm happy, and there's so many things that are that are worth discussing here. So today I'm going to be presenting something on what I will call how possible like explanations. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. And maybe before everything else, I should say sorry to Otavio because he already saw a version of this in January when he was in Chile, right? So this might not be very new for him unless he forgot, which he probably did, right? But so the plan, right? I'm just going to start from scratch and try to explain what how possible explanations are, right? And then focus a little bit on what the modal aspect of how possible explanation is, right? Then introduce a problem, which is like how can we think of how possible explanations in the context of models that seem to have impossible targets or like impossible components. And then I will introduce an idea, which is that we should think about a broader class of explanations of how possible explanations, which I will call the how possible like explanations, which are very much like how possible explanations in certain regards, but avoid the presupposition that what you're trying to explain is something that's possible, right? And the question would then be, so what do we gain by doing that, right? And this is something I'm not entirely sure about, so I would love to hear your thoughts, right? Um, so just to start, this is a quote from Dray from 57, and he gives this example, which is like an announcer broadcasting a baseball game from Victoria, BC said, it's a long fly ball to center field and it's going to hit high up on the fence. The center fielder's back, he's under it, he's caught it, and the batter's out, right? Listener, he knew the fence was 20 feet high, couldn't figure out how the fielder caught the ball, right? So the ball is like 20 feet high, like how did that happen, right? Spectators, people who are looking at the thing, not just hearing the broadcast, right, could have given the unlikely explanation, right? And their explanation was that at the rear of center field was a high platform for the scorekeeper. The center fielder ran up the ladder and caught the ball 20 feet above the ground, right? So there was an explanation for this after all. And Dray, based on examples like this, says, well, this seems to, like the better way to describe this is that we're trying to provide some sort of explanation, right? And we might be unhappy with that decision because maybe explanation doesn't really make sense in cases like this. We can debate that. But anyway, the term stuck, right? And then the thing was that these kind of assertions, let's say, right, were dubbed explanations, right? And they answer a kind of question, right? But it's not the kind of question that the usual explanations seem to target, which are why questions, right? Rather, they target how questions, right? And we can sort of give a brief argument for why we should think that they're like answering this kind of question rather than a why question, right? Because in contexts such as these, there are potentially contextually salient why questions that have easily available answers, right? If we ask, well, why did the center fielders catch the ball, right? Well, he intended that, right? And it was part of his goals, and we can do whatever, right? These questions are not salient in the context that we're dealing with here, but there is a certain how questions, namely, how did the fielder caught the ball, that is contextually salient, right? And we want, in this context, some kind of answer to this question, right? And this is why we say that that we're giving an explanation, right? That question is addressed and resolved by the explanation, right? So what happens here is that the context makes a how question salient because there's an appearance of impossibility to what happened. something happened. We don't know how it could have happened, right? It seems like something impossible happened, right? And in ordinary language, we're very loose with this talk of impossibility. We say, "Oh, that was impossible," but he still did it, or something like that. Which as philosophers, right, we think, "Oh, this is just a cheaty way to talk about these things," right? Center fielders do not usually catch the ball at 20 feet high. That indeed goes against expectations, right? Um, and roughly speaking, in these cases, we want to explain how something could have happened, and this is where the modal aspect of the whole thing comes in, right? We want to grasp how is it that the fact was even possible, right? This is why we call them how possible explanations, right? The historical debates about these things have been in the context of the question of like, are really explanations, are the full explanations, and what's the relation between why explanations and how explanations and so on, right? A common thesis, at least popular for some time, right, was that how possible explanations were partial explanations, that they're parts of like potential explanations, right? So they don't give, for example, they don't tell you why something had to happen, right? But they give you the conditions why it could have been the case that something had to happen, right? So like a sort of like a necessary condition for then a jointly sufficient and necessary condition, right? That's roughly Salomon's view about this, right? And indeed, it seems like complete explanations entail how possible explanations, right? When we give an explanation of why something happened, part of what we answer is trying to explain or account for how the thing that happened, right? And this is when we involve stuff like causal explanations and all sorts of different things that we know, right? Now, Dray himself says that this is misleading because of something that's I think very important, which is that HPEs answer a distinct type of question, which is the how question, right? And in that sense, like they're pragmatically very different from why questions, from explanations given in answer to why questions, right? There's a whole debate still. Brandon argues that HPEs are not complete explanations. There's discussion in Forber, Pearson, Verrault-Julien, and so on, right? Now, something that I'm interested in is there's a secondary discussion about like whether models provide how possible explanations. So we use models for all sorts of things, right? When one of the functions that we give them, right, is sometimes, for example, we use a model as a proof of concept, right? Or trying to explain, well, why and how something could have happened, right? Some models we know are merely hypothetical. They're not concrete. We have imagined them, or we just construct them out of different abstract things, right? And if some of those hypothetical models are able to represent possibilities, right, constructing them can show, at least this is the intuition, right, how something could have happened, right? And Weisberg, in his book from 2013, says that this is how we should understand Schelling's segregation model. I thank Roberto for describing it earlier, because then we can go a bit faster with this. And the model shows that the segregation is possible, even if there's no discrimination at a collective level, or even if no individual has a salient bias, right? And there the question isn't like, why is there segregation? The question is, how could there be segregation if there's no individual or salient bias, right? The question is different, right? So we shouldn't, and this is the point of Weisberg, right? We shouldn't evaluate this model in the same way that we will evaluate a model that tries to explain that tries to give an answer to a why question, right? And Roberto already described this, so I'll be very quick with this, right? Like, so we have different types of individuals represented by different colors, right? Each individual has a location in a grid. They have a preference to what the color of the neighbors should be the same kind, blah blah blah. And progressively, they go turn by turn and check, okay, what's the percentage of my neighbors that are the same color, and what results is this kind of partitioning and clustering of points in the grids that have similar colors, right? And the point, right? is that, well, the point here, right, is that these seems to show like how something abstractly could be possible. Again, going back to Roberto's talk a little bit in that point, right? Verrault-Julien, in a paper from 2018, raises the worry, right, that the challenge model does not answer to a need to explain a phenomenon that is taken to be impossible in any substantial sense, right? And most we might think that it was implausible that segregation emerges from something that is not a strong discriminatory preference, right? So somebody could say, well, never really thought that this was an impossible thing, right? So it's really not appropriate to say that this is how possible explanation. It's like how probable explanation. I think this is just nonsense, right? It's just speaking straws. But there's something important here, which is like we should distinguish between how possible modeling from how possible explaining, because then maybe when we're trying to model something and how it is possible, then in those cases maybe you're not trying to give some kind of explanations of how it's possible. And I think the discussion is really going at that, right? Something important, again, going back to the model aspect of these how kinds of explanations, right, is that is about the relation with how actual explanations. Dray distinguishes HPEs from Y-based explanations in terms of the model content, right? Like, because we could also aim at giving an account of how things had to happen, and this is going to be how he characterizes the usual explanations that are trying to answer a why question, right? Like, and Dray calls these how actual explanations, right? So really, the distinction between how possible explanations and other kinds of explanations is just the model character of their content, right? And his point is that in contexts where certain how possible explanations are salient, we don't require how actual explanations, even when they're available, right? We're just not asking why, we're asking how. So, right? Another problem with HPEs is that they're sometimes likened to what some people call just so stories, and just so stories have very bad rap, right? For good reasons, right? Just so stories are narratives that can be verified, that try to explain some phenomena, and we see them all the time, right? Like earlier I was talking about my account about like model knowledge, right? And for that I just use a Joseph story about how the concept of actuality could work, but that's just a story, I must admit, right? Like I don't really have a good thing. And here's a quote from a review of a book that tried to explain a series of phenomena like religious beliefs in terms of like that these beliefs help people coordinate with others and become less selfish, as less lonely, more fulfilled, right? This kind of vague explanation that sometimes are given of like how something could have happened, right? How come people had to come to have these religious beliefs or whatever, right? And it's problematic because if we want to accept that something like HPEs are genuine and valid explanations and have a function in science, right? We have to distinguish them from other kinds of similar phenomena that can be problematic, like these just so stories, right? So we need to have an account not only of how these HPs work, but how they can work in better ways than similar things that seem to do certain similar things, right? So we need to distinguish that, right? And I would suggest, and I think this is kind of derived from the literature actually, that Joseph stories impose just too few restrictions on the relevant sphere of possibilities. This also goes back to Roberto's thought, this thing of like, okay, we can ask, it could happen that way, but could it actually, like, is there actually a way to go from what's described in that story to what could happen in our world, you know? Sometimes we want to have a link or a tether to the actual world when we define these senses of possibility, right? Even though they can be very broad and restricted, right? Sometimes we want to have like as a parameter that the modalities are defined in terms of the actual world in somehow, right? And and this connection to the actual world, given that actually, right, an actual are modal expressions and context sensitive, right? It might suggest that in different contexts we might be shifting the standards of the standards by which we impose these restrictions into the kind of modalities that we're dealing with, right? So sometimes we can answer a how question with a just so story because the standards are very low, but in other contexts we just impose more restrictions, and that's how we get to more legitimate in that context, right? Explanations. And the cases of HPEs that are discussed in the literature, I think, are involving this kind of like a more restricted, more robust kind of answering of questions, right? And we can generalize this idea and we say, well, a putative explanation is an HPE in a certain context only if, and this is just a sufficient condition, not a necessary condition, given the criteria K that's fixed by the context, right? And it represents a K possibility, right? Like that's a possibility that's least compatible with these criteria that are determined by the context, right? These contextually defined criteria necessarily include some reference to the actual world, as I was suggesting earlier, right? And just so stories do not necessarily meet this criteria. Otherwise, otherwise they really do not differ from HPEs in their model aspects, right? And from this, it also follows that some how actually explanations can be how possible explanations, right? Because if we say, well, this is the way how actually something happened, right? That is an answer to the how possible question. Well, how could it be that X, right? So this is sort of an explanation of how, in different contexts, we are very satisfied with certain HPs, and we go up and down, right? Verrault-Julien, right, in 2018, provides an alternative account of this, right? According to him, HPEs provide information to the effect that possibly P because Q. So this is really the content, not what I'm saying. Like the content of a how possible explanation is possible P, right? Q, and it was possible for Q to happen in the P way, right? He says that the content would be that possibly P because Q. So there are really like possible explanations. And like before, the sense of possibility in questions varies with the context, and this also allows Verrault-Julien to distinguish between HPEs and just stories, right? I think this is just an aside. Really, I think it's a mistake to require that the relation between the exponent and exponent is the because relation, whatever that is, right? Because in many cases we are just worried about like all sorts of different building relations and like the broader class of things that if you have something, right, then you can construct something out of that, and maybe the kind of metaphysical explanation is just a species of that. But this is again a side, right? A problem with this whole thing and with this whole way of thinking about how possible explanation is comes with the fact really that certain models provide that certain models are in some sense impossible, right? For example, this Brownian ratchet, right, that embodies the idealization that if realized will prevent them to be realized, right? And there's the common assumption that HPEs, however, right, must be in some sense possible, and it's like inbuilt in the question in the name itself, right? How possible explanations are about possibilities, right? So if models are impossible, they cannot provide HPEs, right? And then we go back to questions about like, okay, like Shelley's model, is this a possibility or not, right? And is it really a model that provides a how possible explanation? One way to sort of go with this is to say, well, we have a relative sense of impossibility. We might say, well, this is not absolutely impossible. It's just impossible in some restricted sense and so on, right? We do not need to say that apparently impossible models are absolutely impossible in that regard, right? But if we have to account for example, proof of concept models, I think the sense of possibility that's involved is very weak. In the sense of like, in many cases, we don't even know if the thing is feasible or not, and we're still trying to build something, right? And this leads us directly to the question of, okay, so even if we could construct these impossible models, what do they even teach us, right? For example, someone could say that impossible models give us information about part of the phenomena or the limits of what is possible or about general restrictions. And it's like, okay, we're talking about impossible explanations, but they have certain connection with certain phenomena that we observe and they can inform us in certain ways. And this is a fairly common strategy. Nguyen, Verrault-Julien, Weisberg, and Tan all adopted. I think most people in the literature adopt this, right? So, for example, this is Weisberg on the Volterra model. He thinks it's like this. While no real population can have long-term exponential population growth, the model may be a reasonable approximation of population growth in the short run. And more importantly, there are several things that can be learned about real-world targets by studying the model, right? One implementation of this strategy is that while the model is impossible, it might have possible targets. And then the problem will be, what is the connection between the model and the targets? This is a whole thing. Weisberg himself argues that in some cases model might have impossible targets. So he says, well, perpetual motion models like the Brownian ratchet that I was illustrating before might be an instance of this, right? And Verrault-Julien in 2018 says that even in those cases we can extract something about what is the case, right? And this is a kind of a worry to me because I tend to feel like impossibilities are their own thing, and the actual world sometimes doesn't even come into the picture, right? So by making the value of impossible models parasitic on what knowledge we might extract from them, right? Then the only reason why anybody will want to model an impossible target is either ignorance of things that are true of the actual world, or the possession of mistaken beliefs. And I think this kind of, I don't know, this is probably what I would want to have more feedback on. Like I have some insatisfaction here, right? Like my hunch is that impossible targets can be pursued on their own terms, and this is, I guess, like a response to Roberto's talk in a way, right? Like because without making this parasitic on whatever knowledge of actuality these provide us, right? So we can sort of construct these impossible models just because we want to extract information about impossibilities and the structure of impossibility in general, right? I don't think that's very speculative, and I want to defend that it's particularly valuable to do so, and also it sort of escapes the topic of the conference, which is like modeling in science, like necessity and possibility in science, right? But if we are like naturalists, right, and we think that philosophy is sort of continuous in many ways with science, like it's still it's an open thing, right? Okay, so if we're worried in that way, right, like maybe the way that we should go is just generalizing this idea of how possible explanations, right? And if we take waste talk seriously, like many people do, like Fine does, like Jablo does, right? In a world which is basically primarily just a point of evaluation of truths or whatever, really, there are ways in which something is made possible, and ways are not just worlds of stage, so we will have to think of like a metaphysical states or something like that. We get an explanation by grasping these ways in which things are made possible, right? But there's really no need to think that only possible worlds are inhabited by ways that make things true or false. And this is like the intuition of I think this is one of the underlying intuitions of people that admit contrapossible reasoning, is that, well, if we think about ways in a general way, I mean, this is Yagisawa's reasoning too, right? Then why not think of it in all sorts of, in respect to all sorts of objects of interest, right? So then we could get how possible like explanations about impossibilities that don't impose model restrictions and explanations, and then HPEs would be a subject of these things, right? The question is, should we really go in this direction? And like, I'm just curious, right? For me, it's the matter of like, okay, this is an idea, and like I would like to see it pursued, right? I don't know really how far we can go in that direction, right? And reason to assume that HPEs must be restricted to possibilities. So the counter-argument is that when it comes to impossibilities, there's no obvious way to distinguish between genuine explanations from something that merely appears to be explanatory. Something is impossible for a reason, something makes it so, but what is the strength of this, right? And the traditional answer, I think, is that what makes something impossible makes the whole world impossible, right? Because classically, or at least classically, right, from a conjugation, it follows. So, like, if we are thinking about impossible worlds, they tend to be thought as this anarchic kind of thingies, right? That are infected by impossibility in different ways, right? So when we are asking of impossible worlds or something like that, right, for them to like witness like explanations, then what are they really witnessing, right? The availability of explanations seems to depend on what is possible, so maybe we have to drop some assumptions, right? And that suggests that explanation and modality could be taken as orthogonal matters in this way, right? And this all depending on whether this perspective is like sustainable or not, right? The technical problem, and really the big problem, right, is how do we do this? And this is what we also were discussing earlier with Alistair's talk, right? Well, a lot depends on how we deal with impossibilities, right? Like a common way to treat them is to introduce some stock of impossible worlds and just the semantics of the language to handle the cases we're interested in. Yeah, perfect. And the problem with this is that it sort of replicates the foundational problem about like impossibility, really. That, well, the assignment of values to many classes of propositions at impossible worlds is given atomically. For example, in Berto's work on the logic of imagination, he sort of does that, like Priest also does that, right? Where like in possible worlds everything works more or less classically, and then in possible worlds like we treat the value of the truth value of the things like as atomic, and it's sort of like everything goes, right? But there's a fundamental conflict with the idea that there could be explanations of what goes on at impossible worlds, right? Like, because the relation between facts and impossible worlds are not modally robust. We cannot pin down what's going on, right? So these kind of impossible worlds or these approaches just cannot contain answers to why or how questions. Maybe there are ways out. Like, for example, Fine's approach to possibles might do a better job because it poses less restrictions on these things, right? But it faces several problems. Like, I don't know if you're aware of how that works. Like, the idea is that you construct impossible states out of other states, or maybe you take some impossible states as primitives, what he calls modal monsters, and states will have outcomes attached to them, right? So when you're evaluating a counterfactual, basically you're saying, okay, this is my antecedent state, like what are the outcomes of this antecedent state? And you can generalize this to the counterpossible case and say, well, if you have the fusion of states that represents an impossibility, then that also has an outcome, right? Because nothing weird is going on in terms of the fusion, right? You might expect them to keep the same properties that they have, right? And then you get outcomes of all these fusions of these impossible fusions of states, right? And then you get stuff, right? You get outcomes and you get stuff, but it's fairly unrestricted, and that makes it kind of awful, right? It's just ugly. What we really want are possible worlds construed as violations of laws of different kinds, I feel, where those violations do not make those worlds fully open in the sense that their logical behavior is not entirely anarchic, right? And that's an aside on subject matter. Doesn't really matter now, right? So the upshot of the whole thing, right? It's just, okay, we have a problem. Like if we have this is something just to think about, right? Like, but no matter how we do this, there will be a class of truths that's such that will explain facts about impossibilities, if we can find them, right? Which will ground in both impossible models and potential how possible like explanations, right? Now, the explanatory potential of those things is limited, depending on how we construct it. Like, but maybe we can apply it to discussions about counter metaphysicals and so on, right? I mean, essentially, it's the same problem as what you were discussing, right? We do not usually make questions about what makes something impossible, and we don't have ways to answer those, right? But when we're trying to account for hyperintentional phenomena, we actually need that, right? And maybe this is something important that is relevant to the construction of our models of hyperintentional phenomena. If that is the case, then the object is that a counter for HPEs, right, and counter possibles is at the root the same problem, right? And it remains open. I'm sorry, I don't have a solution for you, and that's it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, I missed this one. Stuck.
Thanks. And I think you're right in stressing the importance of taking those impossibility cases more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
In part because I think there are actual cases, right? So if you think about the formulation and the early formulation of the calculus, right, it was inconsistent.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing worked beautifully for 200 years, right? So we cannot just say, well, look, these are just mere possibilities, because science is full of cases like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so then the question is, okay, so this is a situation where Leibniz and Newton were reasoning on the basis of a clearly inconsistent theory. They did not derive everything out of it.
Yeah.
In fact, they managed to produce exactly the right formula for the calculus. How is that possible, right?
Yeah.
So, and it seems to me that, any account that take those things seriously will have to say something about that.
Yeah.
Right? Now, I don't know how to do that, and without changing the underlying logic. Right? Classical logic would trivialize the whole thing.
Yeah.
So, on the other hand, it's implausible to say they were reasoning are consistent. Right? The very idea didn't exist.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So the question is like, how do I think that would be?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I like Lewis' idea of like the fragmentation strategies, right? Like, okay, you're reasoning under heterogeneous. Well, this is not Lewis. This is my version of it, right? Like you're working on the basis of heterogeneous rules, right? And you're fragmenting depending on what the subject matter at hand is, right? So like you can go very far away, right? Like in the case of the calculus, just focusing on what works, right? And just not going through all the consequences, right? And I think that's one of the positives of like logical non-omniscience, right? Just because we are logically non-omniscients, like we have the capacity to do these things, and maybe it's useful, right? So that's more or less the way.
But it's in the same derivation. Infinitesimal is different from zero.
Yeah.
And then a few lines out, it's identical to zero.
Yeah,
So
no.
it's
I mean, in the overall context, like okay, like they could have discovered like a contradiction, right? But they didn't in practice, or they shrugged it
No,
away.
they knew that it was inconsistent.
Yeah.
It's not that they.
But then that's the fragmentation, right? At that level, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I was thinking that perhaps the Brownian ratchets case is actually a better case of a how possibly explanation. So if they actually worked as a perpetual motion machine, then they would be impossible. But we know there are actually Brownian ratchets, but since they can't work in that way because that would violate the laws of thermodynamics, they must work in some other way. And look, it turns out that there is a step where they have to dissipate the energy in order to get the actual ratcheting effect.
Right.
By which I mean getting it to work in one direction but not the other. Because otherwise it would work equally well in both directions, so it wouldn't be right.
Yeah.
It actually works because it doesn't actually violate the laws of thermodynamics. So you can turn it around and turn it into how possibly.
Yeah, no, I think that's sort of captured by the more traditional approach to how possible explanations, by just saying, well, even if there is some impossibility involved here, this might work more like as a prop for doing research on questions that can lead to truths about the actual world. And that's sort of like how I describe what you were saying here. Like, okay, maybe we described it in a certain way, right? That way was impossible, right? But then we figure out like, okay, what made it impossible in that case, and then we sort of work it out. And in that case, I think it's just these models are just like a prop for advancing that, and I'm completely happy with accepting that, right? Like it doesn't have to be so about the impossibility every time, right? That's also true. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like just to go from one sentence to the impossible rules are anarchic. I would like to ask you from, do you think it is possible from how possible like explanation to distinguish one impossibility from another? Like I said, this impossibility is more informative than that one. If I might say in Lewis term, like this impossibility is closer to our model than that one. Or do we need like some how impossible like explanation also to this?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer to that is like if we had a real good account of hyperintentionality, that's exactly what we'll get, right? Because hyperintentionality is like, okay, we have necessary things, right? So the typical way to explain that is like, okay, we have two things that are intentionally equivalent, like two necessities, right? Oh, a mathematical fact and a logical fact, they're necessary, but we want to distinguish them, and by distinguishing them, we introduce hyperintentionality. But like the same thing, it's like in the case of impossibilities, right? Like you have an impossibility of certain kind that's always impossible as another impossibility of a different kind. How do we distinguish them? That's also accounting for the hyperintentionality of that. And if we had a rich enough account of that, then we could say, okay, this impossibility is more or less informative. It really depends on how you exploit or account for these differences. That's the goal.
Okay. Thanks for the presentation. I'm interested in your opinion to some theory rivals, like the conception of explanations by constraint by like Lapland. Do you think this somehow impossible kind of some kind of modality complements it, or do you think you have some conflicts with it? Because according to abstract, I think at least regarding some impossible explanations in mathematics, you share some theoretical intuition. I mean, specifically anti-causal perspectives with Long, who also refers to an Aristotelian view of mathematical futures and patterns to ground such mathematical possibilities, but not the casual reasoning process. But he discussed it, the impossible ontologies, methods, and conjectural theories, and proposed that we can use a primitive notion or primitive conception of the modal conception of explanations, and specifically called explanation by constraints. And that's enough for our story, for our statements regarding these mathematical impossibilities. So yeah, I'm curious about your opinions of this rival. Do we really need another kind of conception of the how possible, but not a combination of a lot of different wide possible explanations?
Right. Okay, so I think that goes a little bit back to the question from back there. It's like I would say, like in spirit, the approach I was suggesting at the very end, right? That you can construct these thing in terms of like violations of laws, in terms very similar to the idea of like a constraint. There's a constraint imposed on what's going on in these worlds. Then the question is like, how much do we need that in about things about the impossible worlds rather than just possible worlds, right? So it's like so like this notion of violation here, right? Is it operative? Is it working intentionally or like in the broader picture, right? Like that is the question, and it's a very good question to see like what's the gain of moving to this broader picture, right? In the case of mathematics, maybe I don't have a settled view, so it might be the case that the intentional picture is enough, but I'm not sure, right? And my point is like in the general picture, like how much do we want? What's the and my hunch is that we need more, right? Like for the general picture, for all the different purposes that we might have, right?
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Felipe. Two key points. So first one was just a curiosity because at some point you were speaking of impossible models.
Yeah.
And then another stage of models of impossible targets.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you were considering them interchangeably because to me they mean quite different
Yeah,
things.
no, they're
An impossible
different.
model would be an incoherent model, let's say. Whereas the other would be a model that maybe might be perfectly coherent insofar as the model is concerned, but is targeting a target that cannot exist. The second question I was having is like, I think we're actually in broad agreement. I don't think there is any tension at all between your project and what I was saying before, in the sense that I agree with you that we might want to engage, explore, and manipulate models of impossible targets considered on their own. What I was really focusing on the bridging the gap between whatever we can learn about this model and the scenario they envision and the real world around this model. And in that, I agree with you. Actually, I think that, for instance, Verrault-Julien, but others in that camp, I think they take it a bit too easily, the possibility of generating knowledge of the actual world from there, especially when they say, oh, we could learn what things would have to be different in order for this kind of target to be nomologically possible. That can be incredibly interesting, but I don't think it's actually about the actual world after all. It's about a different kind of scenario that is relevantly dissimilar with respect to this. And I was wondering whether I actually agree with this.
No, absolutely. So I'll start with that, right? Like I absolutely agree with that. Like I was thinking about it when you were giving your presentation. I was thinking about that. That's the connection between your stuff and mine, right? And your criticism of them, like it's essentially the same criticism of mine. Of like we need to define a way to say, well, what's the connection with the actual world in these models, right? In many cases, we actually want that, right? And if we just have like these abstract possibilities or whatever, right? Like these logical possibilities, it seems like we're changing the subject, right? Like the difference, I think, between your project and mine is like you're really interested in okay, what do they tell us? Or that was the impression about that I got is that what do they tell us about the actual world? Whereas I'm more like, I must confess, I'm a bit of a Platonist, right? So like well, the actual world can just go flying, like I don't care, right? And I think that's a difference, right? But the strategy would be, I mean, I accept, right, that epistemologically to say that just on the basis of these models, of these kinds of models, like we gain knowledge about the actual world is problematic and uncertain, right? I sort of emphasized the difference just for effect, not for. So that was the one thing. The other thing was about. Sorry, can you
the impossible models versus models?
Oh yeah, absolutely right. I was just quick here because it's more complicated. Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker.